You've been told that pulling away from people is a sign something is wrong with you. That withdrawal means depression. That silence means failure. That the friend who stopped calling, the family member who stopped showing up, the version of you that used to be everywhere and now wants to be nowhere, is broken. Carl Jung disagreed. He spent decades studying people who fell apart in exactly this way, and he found something almost nobody wants to hear. Some withdrawal is sickness. And some withdrawal is the most psychologically healthy thing a human being can do. Here is the number that should unsettle you. Jung treated hundreds of patients in the second half of their lives, and he noticed the same pattern again and again in people with money, in people with families, in people who by every outside measure had already won. Not weakness, not failure, a demand. Something inside them was demanding separation, and they kept calling it a problem when it was actually a process. If you can't tell the difference between the two, you will spend years treating your own growth as a disorder. You will medicate a message. You will apologize for something that was never a mistake. You will sit across from people who love you and explain away the very thing trying to save you. So ask yourself right now honestly, when you pulled back this year, was it fear talking? Or was it something else, something quieter, something that knew exactly what it was doing, something that had been waiting years for you to finally stop resisting it? By the end of this, you will know which one it was. Here is the promise, and it is not small. You are not just going to learn a fact about Carl Jung today. You are going to learn how to read your own retreat from the world correctly, maybe for the first time in your life. Because there are two kinds of solitude, and mistaking one for the other has cost people their careers, their marriages, their sense of self. One kind of solitude is collapse. The other is the doorway to what Jung called the self, the deepest center of who you actually are, underneath every role you have ever performed, underneath every version of you built to keep other people comfortable. This is the difference between disappearing and arriving. Most people never learn to tell the two apart, and it is not because the distinction is subtle. It is because everyone around them, every well-meaning friend, every worried parent, every partner who liked the old version better, has an incentive to call it the same thing. Easier to diagnose a familiar illness than to sit with an unfamiliar transformation. And before we go further, understand the stakes. Jung did not treat this as an abstract philosophical curiosity. He treated it as the central task of the second half of life, the task that, left undone, produced the very anxieties and depressions people came to his office trying to escape. Get this distinction wrong and you don't just misunderstand a theory. You misread your own life. Start here. Jung had a word for the self you show at work, at family dinners, in every group text you've ever smiled through. He called it the persona, borrowing the term from the masks actors wore in ancient theater. The persona is not fake exactly. It's adaptive. It's the mask that lets a social animal survive among other social animals. You need one. Everyone does. The problem was never that you wear a mask. The problem is what happens when you forget you're wearing it. Jung watched patients build entire identities out of the persona, until there was nothing left underneath it that they could name. Successful people. Likeable people. People who did everything right and still felt, in his own words, like strangers to themselves. The mask had eaten the face. Think about the last time you performed agreeableness you didn't feel. The nod you gave in a meeting while disagreeing completely. The laugh at a joke that didn't land. The version of you that shows up to keep the peace over and over, until keeping the peace becomes the only skill you have left, the only self you know how to be in a room full of other people. That's the persona operating exactly as designed. Efficient, convincing, and over time, hollow. Here's the mechanism. The more perfectly you play a social role, the more your ego starts to believe the role is you. Jung called this identification with the persona, and it is one of the most common forms of psychological arrest he documented. Not a crisis, an arrest. Growth stops quietly while the performance continues loudly, sometimes for decades, sometimes for an entire lifetime that never once slows down long enough to ask what any of it was for. Picture the patient Jung described so often without naming, the accomplished professional, admired by colleagues, envied by neighbors, who arrives in crisis for a reason they cannot articulate. Nothing has gone wrong. That is precisely the problem. Nothing has gone wrong and nothing has gone right either, not really, not in a way that felt like it belonged to them. You don't feel the mask forming. That's what makes it dangerous. You just wake up one day 40 years old, successful by every visible metric, and feel a hunger you cannot name, a want you cannot explain to your own spouse, a restlessness that no vacation and no promotion has ever managed to quiet. That hunger is not a malfunction. It's the first signal, and once you learn to recognize it, you'll see it was trying to reach you for years, tapping quietly at moments you were too busy performing to notice. In a dream you dismissed. In an irritation you couldn't explain. In the tears that showed up, unwanted, during something that should not have moved you at all. But here's what nobody prepares you for. When that signal finally gets loud enough to act on, it doesn't feel like liberation at first. Feels like the mask cracking. And nothing underneath the mask has fully formed yet. Which is exactly why so many people, standing right at the threshold of something real, panic and glue the mask back on tighter than before and call the panic relief. Jung noticed that this cracking rarely announces itself with drama. More often, it shows up as a strange fatigue attached to things that used to feel effortless. Small talk that once cost nothing now costs everything. A role you used to slip into easily now takes visible, exhausting effort to maintain, and the people around you can feel the effort even when they can't name it. There is no fixed timeline for this. For some people the persona holds for decades before it thins. For others the cracks show early in their 20s and get quietly papered over for years, mistaken for a phase, mistaken for immaturity, mistaken for anything except what it actually was. The age does not matter nearly as much as the honesty you're willing to bring to the question underneath it. What exactly was this mask built to protect? And is it still protecting anything, or is it simply protecting itself? This is the part that matters most, so pay attention because this is where most people get it exactly backwards. Jung was clear, uncomfortably clear, that not all withdrawal deserves the same name. There is a retreat driven by fear. A person avoids the world because the world feels dangerous, judging, unbearable. This is withdrawal as defense. It shrinks you. It's organized entirely around avoidance, around escaping pain rather than moving toward anything. Left alone, it deepens. It isolates without transforming. This is the retreat that needs help, that needs intervention, that is, in every meaningful clinical sense, a symptom, and Jung never romanticized it. He treated it as illness because that is precisely what it was. Then there is a second kind of retreat. Quieter. Stranger. Jung called part of this process regression in service of the personality, a phrase worth sitting with. Regression here doesn't mean going backward in the shameful sense. It means the psyche temporarily withdrawing its energy from the outer, collective world, in order to gather it, concentrate it, and redirect it inward, toward something new trying to be born, something that cannot be built in public, in front of an audience still expecting the old performance. Same behavior on the surface. Someone stops answering calls. Someone stops attending things they used to attend. Someone goes quiet for months and everyone around them assumes the worst. Completely different mechanism underneath. Here is how you tell them apart, and this is the test Jung's own case histories point toward again and again. Fear-based withdrawal is organized around what you're running from. Individuative withdrawal is organized around what you're moving toward, even when you can't yet name what that is, even when it feels, from the inside, indistinguishable from getting lost. There is a second marker Jung pointed to, almost as reliable as the first. Fear-based withdrawal tends to flatten a person, dull their inner life along with their outer one. Individuative withdrawal, by contrast, often comes paired with a strange intensification of the inner world. More vivid dreams. Sudden, unbidden memories. A new fascination with symbols, art, or ideas that would have bored the same person 5 years earlier. The outer life goes quiet. The inner life, if this really is individuation, gets louder. One is defined by an absence. The other, however uncomfortable, is defined by a direction. There is a third marker, and it is the one Jung considered most reliable of all. Fear-based withdrawal tends to resist examination. Ask the person why they've pulled back and you get avoidance, deflection, a change of subject. Individuative withdrawal, however uncomfortable, tends to tolerate the question. There is usually, somewhere underneath the discomfort, an honest sense that something is happening for a reason, even if that reason cannot yet be fully named. A fourth marker, subtler than the rest, involves time itself. Fear-based withdrawal tends to feel endless from the inside, a shrinking with no floor, no natural point of completion. Individuative withdrawal, even at its most disorienting, usually carries a faint sense of season, the felt intuition that this particular chapter of quiet will not last forever, that it is building towards something rather than simply away from everything. Think about your own retreat this year. Were you running from something, Or were you, without quite knowing it, running towards something you hadn't met yet? Were you shrinking, or were you, in some quiet and frightening way, expanding? Has your inner life gone quiet along with your outer one, or has it, against all logic, gotten stranger, richer, more alive? Because Jung believed the coldest, loneliest years of a person's life can, in the right conditions, become the years the real self finally gets a hearing. Not despite the isolation. Because of it. The noise had to stop before the signal could be heard at all. And that hearing requires you to stop performing for an audience first. Which brings us to the loudest voice you've been performing for all along, the collective itself. Let's take a short pause here. If any of this is landing, if you're recognizing your own retreat in what Jung is describing, stay with the channel. Subscribe if you haven't. Because the next part is where this stops being theory and becomes something you can actually use this week in your own life the next time someone asks you why you've gone quiet. We left off with a direction, a pull towards something unnamed. Now let's name what you're pulling away from. Jung had another concept, older cultures gave him the seed of it, and he expanded it into something clinical. Participation mystique. A state where the boundary between you and the group dissolves, where you feel what the group feels, want what the group wants, fear what the group fears without ever separating your own judgment from theirs. You've lived this. Everyone has. The opinion you hold that you never actually examined because everyone around you holds it too. The goal you're chasing that was never yours, inherited instead from a family, a culture, a feed you scroll every morning, a version of success somebody else designed a long time before you were born. Jung considered the collapse of participation mystique a necessary, almost violent stage of individuation. His word for the lifelong process of becoming a distinct, undivided self rather than a fragment of the group mind. Not selfishness. Not withdrawal from love. Simply the ego, learning for the first time to stand on ground that belongs to no one else. Here is the mechanism stripped down. As long as you're fused with the collective does your thinking for you. Efficient in a sense. Also fatal to becoming anyone in particular. Individuation cannot begin until that fusion cracks, and the cracking, Jung observed clinically, almost always produces a period of isolation. Not chosen for its own sake. Required, structurally, by the process itself, the way a bone has to be reset before it can heal straight. There is a companion piece to this that Jung insisted could not be skipped. The shadow. Everything you exiled from the persona because it didn't fit the mask, every impulse, every anger, every appetite you learned was unacceptable doesn't disappear. It goes underground and it waits. When participation mystique starts to crack, the shadow is often the first thing to surface, uninvited, in dreams, in sudden outbursts, in behavior that embarrasses the very persona trying to keep control. This is not a setback. Jung considered meeting the shadow the unavoidable first threshold of the entire journey toward the self. This is why the person mid-individuation looks, from the outside, like someone falling apart. Friends worry. Family intervenes. Co-workers whisper that something has changed and not for the better. And meanwhile, something entirely different is happening on the inside. An ego for the first time, learning to stand without the crowd's permission, feeling its own weight for the first time in years, meeting parts of itself it had spent an entire adulthood refusing to look at. Jung lived this himself. In the years following his break from Freud in his late 30s and early 40s, he entered what he later described as a prolonged confrontation with his own unconscious, a period so disorienting that colleagues genuinely feared for his sanity. He withdrew. He stepped back from much of his public work. He went, by every outside measure, quiet, almost invisible, for years, filling private notebooks with the images and voices that rose up once the noise of his public career finally stopped. And it was inside that quiet that the concepts you're hearing right now were forged, tested first on himself, long before they were ever tested on a patient. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. What opinion are you holding right now, today, only because the group is holding it? What ambition are you chasing only because it was handed to you early, before you were ever old enough to refuse it? And what would it cost you to test whether any of it is actually yours? There is a quieter version of this question worth asking too. Not what you believe, but who you become in a room. Do you notice yourself shifting opinions slightly depending on who is listening? Do you notice a different posture, a different vocabulary, a different appetite for risk, depending on which group has you inside its orbit that day? None of that makes you dishonest. It makes you, in Jung's terms, still largely undifferentiated from the collective, a self that has not yet been asked to hold its shape without an audience reinforcing it. Because Jung's answer was blunt. You cannot meet the self while you're still fused with everyone else's expectations of you. The crowd has to reseat first. That recession is the pulling away you've been mistaking for a problem. But here is the part that separates a curious idea from a dangerous one. Once this process actually begins, it does not stop at loneliness. It goes somewhere darker first. Jung described a threshold almost every individuating person eventually crosses, whether they want to or not. He called it meeting the shadow, the disowned half of the personality, made up of everything the persona was built to hide. Think about the traits you were taught early were unacceptable. Anger in a family that prized calm. Ambition in a family that prized humility. Need in a family that prized independence above everything else. None of that disappeared when you learned to suppress it. It went underground, and it waited patiently for the mask to loosen enough to let it back into the room. Jung worked with a composite of patients that will sound familiar to almost anyone. A person spends a lifetime being the reliable one, the calm one, the one who never causes trouble. Then, in the middle of exactly the kind of withdrawal we've been describing, something erupts. An outburst that shocks everyone who thought they knew this person. A desire they can no longer pretend not to have. A grief, decades old, finally loud enough to be heard. The family calls this a breakdown. Jung called it, more often than not, a breakthrough wearing an ugly disguise. Here is the mechanism. The shadow cannot be integrated while you're still performing the persona at full volume, because the persona's entire job is to keep the shadow hidden. Withdrawal from the collective doesn't just quiet the outside world. It turns down the volume on the performance holding the shadow underground. And when that volume drops, the shadow inevitably gets louder. This is not a detour from individuation. Jung considered it close to the first non-negotiable stage of the entire process. You cannot walk past the shadow on your way to the self. You walk through it or you don't arrive at all. Ask yourself what has been surfacing in you lately that would have embarrassed the old version of yourself completely. An anger you can no longer swallow. A want you can no longer deny. A memory you can no longer keep filed away. That is not proof you are falling apart. It may be proof the mask has finally loosened enough to let the rest of you back in the room. Jung was careful here, and the caution matters as much as the concept. Meeting the shadow is not the same as being ruled by it. The goal was never to let every suppressed impulse run the show simply because it finally found a voice. The goal was integration, bringing the disowned part into conscious relationship with the rest of the personality, so it stops operating in the dark, unsupervised, sabotaging the very life it wants a place in. A shadow acknowledged becomes material to work with. A shadow denied stays a saboteur. This is the most unsettling part of everything Jung wrote on this subject, so sit with it fully. He believed that once the ego has genuinely tasted separation from the collective persona, once it has glimpsed something of the self underneath the mask, retreating back into the old, fused identity does not restore peace. It produces neurosis. A forced regression, back into a role the psyche has already outgrown, generates exactly the symptoms people were trying to avoid by retreating in the first place. Anxiety where there used to be calm. Depression where there used to be routine. A gnawing sense of falseness that no external success can quiet, no matter how loudly the outside world applauds the performance. In other words, the mask no longer fits, and pretending it does is what makes people sick, not the process of removing it. Jung saw this again and again in patients who tried to reverse the process out of fear, out of guilt, out of pressure from families who preferred the old, familiar, predictable version of them. They went back to the old job, the old marriage dynamic, the old role at the table. And the symptoms that had driven them to withdraw in the first place returned, sharper, because now the psyche knew exactly what it was being denied. Notice the trap hidden inside this. The people around someone in individuation almost always want the old persona back, because the old persona was easier to live with, easier to predict, easier to love without being changed by. That pressure is not malicious most of the time. It is simply the collective, doing what collectives do, pulling its members back toward the average. Jung considered resisting that pull, gently but firmly, one of the loneliest and most necessary acts of the entire process. Picture the version of this Jung saw repeated across very different lives. A person begins to withdraw, begins to change, begins for the first time to speak in a voice that sounds less like the family's voice and more like their own. The people closest to them, frightened by the change, campaign quietly for the old version to return. Sometimes they succeed. And what comes back when it comes back is never simply the old, comfortable self. It is that self, plus the memory of having briefly glimpsed something else, plus the resentment of having given it up. Jung watched this produce some of the deepest, most stubborn depressions he ever treated, precisely because the patient could no longer claim ignorance of the alternative. This is why Jung refused to treat individuation as optional self-improvement, something to try if convenient and abandon if inconvenient. Once glimpsed, the self does not politely wait forever to be met. Ignore the summons long enough and the psyche stops asking. It starts insisting, usually through exactly the symptoms the person was trying to avoid by staying safely inside the old mask. This is the loop we opened at the very beginning, and here is where it closes. The withdrawal you feared was collapse. Was, the entire time, a demand from the psyche to stop performing an identity that had already expired. Ignore that demand, force yourself back into old patterns, back into old rooms, back into old roles that no longer contain you, and the cost is not peace. The cost is worse than the discomfort you were trying to escape in the first place. There is no undoing this once it starts. That is not a threat. It is simply how Jung understood the architecture of psychological growth. You can delay the confrontation. You cannot cancel it. You can postpone the reckoning for a year, for a decade, but the bill, Jung would say, always eventually comes due, usually at a worse hour than the one you originally avoided it in. So the question stops being whether to withdraw. The question becomes whether you will let the withdrawal finish what it started, or abandon it halfway, caught between a persona you no longer believe in and a self you haven't yet met, belonging fully to neither. Here is the metaphor Jung's whole model comes down to. A snake does not shed its skin because it is hiding. It sheds because the old skin has stopped fitting a body that has already grown past it. For a while, the old skin looks the same from the outside. It is already, underneath, obsolete. Your withdrawal is not always a symptom. Sometimes it is a shedding. The persona was never the enemy. It got you through years you needed to survive, years you were not yet ready to face alone. The shadow was never the enemy either, only the part of you exiled too early, waiting too long for an invitation back in. But a mask worn past its purpose stops protecting you, and starts imprisoning you, and Jung's entire body of work was an argument that the discomfort of removing it is nothing compared to the cost of refusing to. None of this required you to become someone unrecognizable. Jung was never arguing for the destruction of the persona, only for its demotion, from ruler of the personality to servant of it. The mask stays useful. It simply stops being mistaken for the face underneath. So here is the binary choice, and only you can answer it. You can keep performing the collective self, the one built from other people's expectations, comfortable, familiar, quietly hollow, and known in exhausting detail by everyone except you. Or you can let the isolation you've been fighting actually finish its work, and meet whatever is waiting underneath the mask, on the other side of the silence you have been so afraid of. One of those paths feels safer today. Only one of them leads anywhere. The choice is individual, and it will not wait indefinitely for you to feel ready. Jung's own patients rarely felt ready. They simply at some point ran out of road on the old path and had to choose. Notice too that this is not a choice you make once and finish. Jung considered individuation a lifelong task, not a weekend project with a certificate at the end. The mask will try to reassert itself. The crowd will call you back more than once. The shadow will surface again in a new shape, at a new decade of your life, asking again to be recognized rather than exiled. The task is not to arrive at some final, finished self and stop. The task is to keep choosing direction over comfort, honestly, each time the choice comes back around. If this reframes something for you, if you finally have language for a retreat you couldn't explain before, subscribe to the channel, there is more of this waiting for you. Now go back to the last time you pulled away from everyone. Ask yourself honestly one final time. Were you disappearing? Or were you finally arriving?